Story 1. My mother was never married to my father. She was his mistress. I knew my father was married to another woman and had 3 children with her. I thought he had split from her, married my mother, and that they had my sister and me, then separated and he returned to his original wife. That was not true. My mother had been his mistress. It is strange to know that if my father had been faithful, neither my sister nor I would exist. We are literally illegitimate children. Story 2. My mother's first marriage was horribly abusive. There is still a hole in the back of the cupboard where he threw an iron at her. She left her dog with her parents because she could not guarantee its safety. She left him, he killed himself. Good riddance. She never wanted me to know, but my grandmother likes to share secrets. I hope her reason for keeping it secret was not that she did not want me to see her as a victim, because I do not see her that way. She kept her dog safe and left the relationship. She is a warrior. Story 3. My grandfather lived with his mother-in-law, his sister-in-law, and his wife. His wife left, and he had sexual relationships with his mother-in-law and his sister-in-law. The sister-in-law, who had the intellectual functioning of about a 7-year-old, gave birth to a baby who was placed for adoption. She carried a baby doll for the rest of her life. Story 4. My dad is named Gerald Jr. He, my grandfather, and my great-grandfather all go by Jerry. I wondered why he was not Gerald III, since he was named after his father and grandfather. It turns out my great-grandmother named my grandfather Gerald, thinking that was my great-grandfather's full name. My great-grandfather's name is Gerard, not Gerald. Story 5. On the side of my mother, one branch of the family descended from French aristocrats. Their daughter married a man who emigrated to the United States and bought a plantation. According to one census, the household owned 40 enslaved people. Within a couple of generations, that branch went from being extremely wealthy and well-respected to becoming traveling circus workers who lived in shacks. Story 6. On my mother's 70th birthday, after quite a few drinks, she told my sister and me she had another child before we were born. At her 80th birthday party, he was a guest. Story 7. Members of my family died in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. I had always been told otherwise, and it was not until my sister and I had DNA tests that we found our relatives in Japan who had died during the war. Story 8. My aunt had a child in the 1950s that no one knew about, maybe except her parents. My dad, her younger brother, thought she went away to school for a year and did not connect the dots. My cousins and I had dinner with the child, now a grown woman, and she is absolutely fabulous. Story 9. My grandmother raised her nephew after his sister and her husband died. I always thought it was a car accident, but one day I asked my mother what happened. She said his father killed his mother and then himself when she said she was leaving him. They were, to the best of their knowledge, 99% sure that was what happened. The mother had told family she was going to tell him. My cousin was 8 and in the house. A neighbor saw him outside playing the next day and asked why he was not at school. He said his parents were still sleeping. The neighbor thought that was odd, went in, and found them. My mother told me not to say anything to my cousin because he had repressed the memory. About 20 years later, while we were talking about something else, he suddenly stopped and asked if I knew what had happened to his parents. I told him I did, and he said he had just remembered it a few weeks earlier. He quickly returned to the previous conversation. I called my mother to tell her she might receive a phone call. To the best of my knowledge, he has never spoken to anyone else about it. Story 10. One of my uncles shot the other. The shooter had given his life savings to the other uncle to buy land in his name, but the money was gambled away. Story 11. My grandfather groomed and abused several girls from a very poor family who lived down the street from him, using the guise of tutoring to help with their math grades. Law enforcement was contacted, but it was a small town and he had influence with the local officers, so the accusations were never taken seriously. 15 years after he died, the allegations were raised at his wake, and no one in my family will acknowledge them. Story 12. My great-grandfather was a widower with 3 children. My great-grandmother agreed to marry him only if he would get rid of the children. He sent the children to different family members and married her. They had 1 child together, but he regretted turning away his children. He divorced his wife and married another woman. She was kind and brought the children back to where they belonged. All of this happened in the 1920s. Story 13. It was not as shocking as some stories, but I learned that one of my cousins had a child out of wedlock when she was in high school. Her parents sent her to a boarding school in California, where she had a son whom she gave up for adoption. I am not sure whether it was her choice. This was the 1950s. Her parents were well regarded in the community, and this would have reflected badly on them, especially my uncle, who was in the military, to have a wayward daughter. Years later, my uncle went to the trouble of tracking down that child and found him still in California with a wife and children, doing well. He asked his sister-in-law, my mother, and his wife whether he should tell my cousin, and they decided not to. My cousin had married in the meantime to a man who had a couple of children from his first marriage, and I suspect she had never told him about the son she gave up. The story is not sensational, just heartbreaking. I do not know if the son ever tried to find his biological family. Story 14. My cousin was due to marry a man who looked like Shrek. We had the wedding invitation. It was about a month away. Suddenly it was called off and no one talked about it. My mother told me at the time that he had hidden gambling debts from her and had planned that they would sell her house to pay them off when they married. About 10 years later, I found out that, although the gambling debts were real, the actual reason was that she found a laptop he had hidden in the attic that contained child pornography, and he was sent to jail. That was apparently difficult to arrange because he was a police officer. I can understand why they did not tell anyone at the time. Story 15. My aunt had a secret relationship with her sister's husband for 2 years. It came to light when he got her pregnant. My aunts no longer speak to each other, and the aunt who was cheated on blames her divorce on her sister. Her ex-husband claimed he was sexually assaulted by the aunt he had an affair with, and some family members believed him. Story 16. My father was actually my stepfather, who took care of 6 children, all my siblings, as if he were our father, with unconditional, ever-loving care. We remember him even 25 years after his passing. His heart should never have stopped beating. How could it? It is impossible. How could a heart stop when it is made of gold? Story 17. My supposedly sterile great-uncle left illegitimate children all over western Pennsylvania. I find a new cousin about every other month. Also, my great-great-grandfather was arrested by federal agents for running moonshine in and around Clearfield. Story 18. After my mom and dad passed away, I did my heritage and ancestry deoxyribonucleic acid tests to see if I could find my maternal half-brother. I found him, his daughter, and 2 males who share 11 to 14% of my deoxyribonucleic acid. Those males were the sons of a half-sister I did not know about. My mother had a baby girl less than 2 years after my brother and had her privately adopted right after she was born. Apparently the rest of the family knew. I was the last to find out. I grew up as an only child. Finding out I have 2 older half-siblings still messes with me. There is also a chance I might have another half-sibling from my father. I have not found any leads on that. Only time will tell. My mother's side of the family is mafia through and through. I thought it was nonsense, but newspapers and court documents say otherwise. I am convinced that if my father had never married my mother, I would have been adopted out, given her track record. Story 19. Both of my uncles had illegitimate sons who were kept hidden from the family until after my grandparents died. Each uncle later married and had 3 daughters. None of the wives or daughters knew about the sons. After my grandmother's death, my uncles removed almost all the possessions from my grandparents' house and treated my mother very poorly. In response, she took decisive action and revealed the truth. Story 20. At the age of 80, my father received a visit from a young person he had not known about. Story 21. One of my great-grandmothers had her first child at the age of 12. She was 14 years younger than my great-grandfather. It makes me wonder about the circumstances of their relationship. They went on to have 5 more children. Story 22. I grew up with a younger brother and wondered if there was a 3rd child. My mother read books about adopted children finding their birth families. My mother graduated a year later than her twin because of rheumatic fever. I wondered if it had been romantic fever. My father died in 2006. In 2009, my mother called and said he had another daughter who had been born and given up for adoption before he met my mother. He had told my mother about her when they dated and had sworn her to secrecy. My father never wanted my brother or me to know about our sister. I was right. Happily, we live about 300 kilometers apart. She is my best friend, and my brother likes her and has accepted her. Story 23. There is a very old picture of our family from the 1930s and 1940s standing on a bridge. One day I really look at it. Mother, is that a Nazi uniform? Story 24. My biological grandfather beat my grandmother so severely that after many attempts she was able to leave him in the early 1960s. My grandmother told her 3 daughters they had to choose. If they went with her, they would never see their father again. My mother has a sister she has not seen since 1962. Story 25. Grandpa ran away from home and joined the circus when he was a child. He ran the shooting gallery. When he was old enough, he joined the United States Air Force and fought in the Korean War. He was shot down and lived in a foxhole for 3 weeks, then barely made it back to base. With outdated codes. After returning home, he hitchhiked from Ohio and worked as a caddy for a famous golfer from Dallas named Bill. He started a family and opened a bakery making donuts. He is still active at 94, takes no medications, lives alone, mows his own yard, and plays golf. Story 26. My maternal grandmother died after my grandfather infected her with human immunodeficiency virus. He was a pastor. They lied and were both reported to have died of cancer. Story 27. My grandmother was a player and a kook. She was married to Grandpa and had 5 children, but only 2 survived. World War II was happening. She left Grandpa and the town in the dark of night with a man she had met at bingo and moved across the country. She quickly left that man and met Ken. She divorced Grandpa and married Ken. She was with Ken for a few years and everything was fine. Then she suddenly ran away from Ken, who was apparently a very nice man, and returned to Grandpa. She divorced Ken and married Grandpa again. A couple of years later, she ran off with a wealthy man named Clarence. She did not divorce Grandpa, but he was fed up with her behavior. She decided to leave Clarence and go back across the country. Grandpa, who was still her husband, turned her down. A few years later, she was found running around her neighborhood naked, carrying an axe, looking for her husbands. She was not on drugs. After that, we began visiting Grandma in the care home. Story 28. Not my family, but a friend was researching genealogy and discovered that her paternal grandmother had 2 husbands at the same time. She married the first husband, who went off to war and was reported dead. 3 years later, she remarried the second husband. 2 years after that, the first husband returned, very much alive. The Pacific Theater was chaotic. Apparently, she did not want to divorce the second husband, so she decided to keep both husbands. They all lived in the same house. Story 29. My mum died of a stroke at the age of 61. When my brother and I were going through her things, we found old medical documents. We discovered she had cancer when we were little, but she kept it a secret from everyone except our grandmother. This all happened shortly after my dad had an affair and left. Life can be so unfair. Story 30. My grandfather, who died before I was born, was unfaithful to my grandmother and sexually abused his children. I guess that explains why my mother and uncle are so damaged. Story 31. My grandmother was born after her mother was raped by the mother's stepfather. Story 32. My mother married my dad's best friend's brother, then had affairs with that man's nephew, my dad's best friend's son, and with another man. She left her husband, moved out of town with the other man, and left us. She acts high and mighty, as if she is perfect. She is now on her 5th husband and is exhausting. Story 33. When I was 12, I found out the man I had called Dad all those years was not my biological father. I still call him Dad, and he will always be my father. Story 34. Everyone in my family, except my father as far as I know, has been sexually assaulted by strangers at some point in their lives. For children and my mother. Story 35. Nearly every male member of my family is either a sexual abuser or a rapist, almost always targeting a sibling, cousin, or child. Until recently, these cases were handled within the family and not reported to the police. Story 36. My great-great-grandmother was Native American and was literally purchased by my great-great-grandfather. My grandmother finds it romantic and says they fell in love. My mother and I are trying to get her to stop talking about it and romanticizing it. Story 37. My grandfather was partly responsible for my uncle taking his own life at 13. On the day of the funeral, my grandfather lay on his grave and cried in the rain because he had lost his only son. Later, my grandmother stepped outside their front door to stop some kids bullying my aunt. When my grandfather came home from work, he saw her and beat her, which caused her to lose the pregnancy. It was a boy. Bob died in 2024, but I only found out everything afterward. Story 38. An old family friend became a mass murderer and killed 4 members of his family. This happened when I was 5 years old, and my aunt was dating him at the time. My other aunt told me about it last August. He was in my home after the killings. Story 39. I discovered that the man I had believed was my grandfather my whole life is not, and that I inherited my thyroid problems from my biological grandfather's side. My doctor told me my thyroid problems were genetic even though I had said no one in my family had them. Now I know why. This discovery came 3 years before Ancestry opened Pandora's box my grandmother wanted closed. Story 40. I learned that my dad woke up every day, dressed in a suit, and said he was going to work, but he did not have a job and had been deceiving the whole family. He also filed for bankruptcy behind my mom's back. They are divorced now. Story 41. My grandfather used to run off with other women every couple of years. Apparently they grew tired of him after about a week. He would return to my grandmother, and after a big argument they would move on. No one told me until I was middle-aged and he had died because it never lasted long enough to affect the marriage. He had also been sexually abused by monks as a child. Story 42. My father's family was pretty well off, but my grandfather broke federal laws regulating his business. He had to sell his share of the business to pay legal fees and avoid prison. The family fortunes took a nosedive after that. Story 43. My maternal grandmother had 3 children by 3 different men. My aunt still does not know that the man she believes is her father is not her biological father. Story 44. My grandmother hit and killed a 6-year-old child with her car and spent years in a sanitarium. I found out when I was in my 30s, and she had been dead for about a decade. Story 45. My father retired from the Defense Department after 40 years. He became a highly specialized consultant and began earning a substantial income. He had a distant location he visited frequently for work. It turned out that, in addition to renting a studio apartment for himself there, he was also paying for an apartment for a mistress. Story 46. A small southern community is fairly certain that my grandfather killed his drunken, abusive grandfather. There was never an investigation or a trial. The sheriff reportedly said every man in the area who did not do it should hang his head in shame. Story 47. My many times great-grandfather was King Henry VIII's personal physician and was knighted after saving Anne Boleyn's life. He was a fascinating man. Story 48. Oof. Grandpa was a truck driver after World War II. He regularly sexually abused members of the family. It makes me sick to think about because my aunts are some of the kindest people I know. To think of what they endured is heartbreaking. I can't dwell on it much, but it is worth mentioning what can happen behind closed doors when abuse becomes normalized. I learned about this in my 30s. Knowing what I know now, my childhood was never the same. Story 49. A great-aunt had a child out of wedlock. The child was taken away because the mother was unwed. The great-aunt later married the man who had fathered the child and went on to have 15 more children. The first child took an ancestry test and contacted her birth mother in time for a family reunion. Because that side of the family was large, my cousins and I did not realize we had not met her before, and everyone welcomed her. It was sad that she had been taken away, especially since her parents married shortly afterward. Story 50. My father was abusive to my mother. She attempted suicide but was saved by my brother. I may be the child of marital rape. I was born prematurely because her kidneys failed. I wonder whether poison was involved. Story 51. My biological grandfather died in the hospital after he set himself on fire because he was addicted to smoking. Story 52. My aunt had a son, gave him a false name, and never told him who his father was. Years later, a family friend revealed the father's identity. He was already married, had just had a baby, and his wife came from the same town as my aunt. The father had several children with his uncommon surname. My aunt's son had many children and grandchildren. So if the father's family checks DNA tests, they will find numerous unexpected close relatives with that surname. Story 53. Long story short, a girl I grew up with is my half-sister. Story 54. My fourth great-grandfather married a woman who had two sisters and had two children with his wife. He then had an affair with the middle sister and fathered two children. When his wife died, he married the youngest sister while continuing the relationship with the middle sister and had three more children. Story 55. We had long believed that one of my great-great-great-great-grandfathers was a man of minor note in the early colonization of Australia. It turns out that descendants of one of his children are genetically related to one of his servants, not to him. Story 56. My aunt married her aunt's ex-husband. Uncle Don remained part of the family. No one cared at holiday gatherings. Took me years to understand because no one seemed bitter or bothered. Story 57. My granddad ran off when the ship he was supposed to be on sank and started another family a few towns over. He was spotted one day with his new wife and children and went back to my granny, who refused to ever set foot in that town again and forbade any talk of it. Story 58. Thanks to the 23andMe genetic testing service, my first cousin contacted me. After discussing where family members lived and worked, we learned that my mother had been unfaithful and the man who raised me was not my biological father. Both the man who raised me and my biological father had died a couple of years earlier, so I never got to sort it out. My mother does not want to talk about it, so I do not have many details. I have gotten to know my cousin and a niece, which has been nice. Story 59. My great-uncle, who was Jewish, pretended to be a Nazi guard at a prison camp to avoid detection. He lived with them, drank, and gambled with them. He said he was living comfortably in the camp until they brought in a prisoner who had worked at his father's factory and recognized him. He ran and eventually made it to the United States, where he started a new family and life. Story 60. There is so much terrible stuff. I am not even sure which is most shocking. Story 61. Long before I was born, my uncle's first marriage ended in divorce because he was sleeping with another service member while stationed in Germany. His ex-wife became a madam in Nevada and was arrested. He had 4 wives in total. At his funeral, the first wife prostrated herself across his casket, loudly proclaiming her undying love. She then introduced herself to my cousin, who was the child of the second wife, as his stepmother, and to my sister and me as our aunt. Story 62. After my grandmother and grandfather divorced in the 1980s, my grandmother had custody of my mother and uncle. My grandfather booked 3 tickets to Lebanon and took them there without permission. My youngest great-uncle chased him at high speed on the highway, jumped from his car onto my grandfather's car like a stunt performer, stopped it, and recovered the children. My uncle did not speak to my grandfather for the rest of his life. My mother repaired the relationship after she had me and my brother, and we visited him in Lebanon when we were children. He was not a bad man. He loved his children and was desperate at the time. My grandmother, on the other hand, still villainizes all 3 of her ex-husbands and speaks ill of them, even though 2 of them remarried and have since passed away. Story 63. My uncle is responsible for post-accident drug testing. He derailed a freight train in Wyoming in 1979. The National Transportation Safety Board report noted his history of alcoholism, but no toxicology testing was performed. He was unconscious in the caboose and did not apply the emergency brake when the train ran away. It was a very destructive wreck, but there were no injuries. There was no apparent reason for the incident other than the conductor being unconscious, possibly due to benzodiazepines. Less than a year later, there was another runaway train in California that was fatal. There was no reason to suspect drug use, but the National Transportation Safety Board report noted that everyone was tested for drugs and alcohol, even though there was no reason to suspect anyone was under the influence. I did not piece it together until I read the National Transportation Safety Board report side by side. There were other issues involved, such as air brake problems and steam on the trains. Story 64. My grandmother ran away from her family in Nebraska at a very young age. She was 13 when she married my grandfather, who was well into his 20s. She lied about her age and her name. In 2016, 8 years after my grandfather died, she was watching a television program about her family searching for her and finally came clean to everyone. It is sad that my grandfather never knew the truth, and even if he had, he was suffering from Alzheimer's disease. They had been married for 56 years and had 7 children together. Story 65. My paternal grandfather was a very wealthy, self-made businessman who owned a Royal Enfield in the 1950s and 1960s. He died when my father was 8 years old. The wealth he left for his children, who were between 8 and 16, was taken over by my grandfather's younger sister and brother. My widowed grandmother, my father, and his siblings had to go to their relatives' doorsteps to beg for food, clothes, and money. Apparently, my grandfather died early because he stopped taking his prescribed medications. Consider who might have made him stop, since they believed that taking medicines to prolong life was rebellion against the Lord's plans. Recently, one of the children of my father's paternal aunt posted an Instagram story claiming that my grandfather had given the business to his sister before he died and that they are now closing the business with a heavy heart. Story 66. I realized I had been adopted when I discovered that my parents were actually 3 raccoons stacked inside an overcoat. Story 67. My father was a pedophile whose parental rights were terminated for most of his children. I was the last child, and my mother was too young and addicted to drugs to fight. His family blamed my mother, but I later learned they all knew exactly what he had done and protected him instead of me. I was raised in hell because people said it was not nice to air dirty laundry. Story 68. My father told me my grandfather was part of a group that hunted and killed Filipinos who were considered traitors to their village during the Japanese occupation. Story 69. My uncle, who has schizophrenia, apparently fathered a child before he was sent to a long-term group home. Her parents never told us, and we only made contact with him this year through Ancestry. Story 70. I was the only person in my immediate family who did not use cannabis or take edibles. It was a shock to learn. My dad, my mom, my little brother, and almost everyone on my dad's side of the family did. Story 71. My uncle married a German woman from Berlin in the United States after World War II. Her mother worked as a maid during the war in the house of Joseph Goebbels in Berlin. Needless to say, they did not talk about it. Her mother lived in the United States for more than 30 years after the war and never learned English. When we visited, they, including my uncle, spoke only German in front of us. We had no idea what they were saying. Felt very rude. Story 72. My grandfather, whom I never met, was the accountant for a notorious gangster. Apparently, my grandfather was not the best at hiding money. Story 73. Family secrets remind us that bloodlines often hide chaos and drama. Story 74. My aunt has a daughter but does not know where she is. They have not spoken in years. The daughter apparently called my dad once from jail. I have never met her and did not even know she existed. Story 75. My great-uncle was deeply involved and fairly high up in a global money laundering operation. Story 76. I found out I had a half-brother who was born the year my parents got married. Story 77. My uncle was divorced twice and had a long-term girlfriend. When I say long-term, I mean more than 30 years. He was not going to get married again, and she was fine with that. She was welcomed and treated as family. My grandfather, my uncle's father, moved back near us to receive care for late-stage dementia and alcoholism. She regularly went to his place to help maintain the home, make sure he was okay, and assist with his care. We discovered she had been writing herself checks from his account. Not small amounts. She took him for a lot of money. My grandfather did not care. He knew he was at the end of his life and was indifferent. The rest of the family splintered. Some would not accept her, others completely rejected her, and some lived with her to appease my uncle, who decided to stay with her after finding out. Story 78. My nan found out she has a half-brother after other relatives took a deoxyribonucleic acid test. She is almost 90 and he is nearly 80, so that is what great-granddad was up to during World War II. The surprising part is that, when I talked about this new uncle with my mother, it turned out Nan has a half-sister who lives only a few hours away in a different part of the country. She had one phone call with her, did not like her, and has not been in touch since. Story 79. My maternal grandfather cheated on my grandmother and divorced her to marry his secretary. To be fair, they had only married because he had gotten her pregnant. My mother loved her stepmother and gave me her middle name when I was born as a kind of fuck you to her own mother. I did not know any of this until my mother was on hospice. Story 80. My mother's maternal family were millionaires during the Roaring Twenties but fell into bankruptcy during the Great Depression. A family of 12 lived on food stamps in a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom shack. Story 81. My little sister is my half-sister. We have the same mother but different fathers. She does not know. Story 82. Not my family, but I learned something about my girlfriend's family. She told me that her cousin slept with the husband of another cousin and became pregnant with that man's child. The baby died 2 months later. From what I gathered, people suspect foul play by either the husband or the cousin who was cheated on. The affair is believed to have begun when the woman who later became pregnant was a teenager. Story 83. My dad's first name is Jamie, not James. I learned this when I was 17 after finding an engraved pocket watch with his name. He did not like that a girl in his kindergarten class had the same name as him. Story 84. My paternal grandfather, who passed away a few years ago, was a cousin of the royal family of the Joseon dynasty in Korea. Story 85. My grandfather took his own life. I had thought he died from health issues. He disappeared, and they found him in his car with an empty bottle of alcohol. He never drank, but the alcohol was lethal when combined with the medication he was taking. We believe it was intentional. Story 86. My grandfather cheated on my grandmother, and that's why he lived in Japan his whole life and why I had Japanese family. Everyone forgave each other, and my grandfather died in 2008. My Japanese uncle and family were not treated any better by my grandfather. This all came out at least 18 to 20 years ago, so for most of my life it has been a fact of life. Even before I knew, it was normal to me that my grandfather lived in Japan and that I had Japanese relatives. However, it made me have a lower opinion of my grandfather, especially because he verbally abused my grandmother. That was not okay. I wish someone had been there to punch him in the face when he did that, but I wasn't alive then. Story 87. 2 first cousins on the same side of the family had sex. The male cousin later fled the country after becoming involved with another woman who was dating a gang member. The female cousin later married a much older man and remained in their home country. I find this disturbing, especially because they knew they were related. Story 88. This is about my cousin. She went on holiday to Bosnia a few months ago and received a message from a brother she never knew she had. They are both in their late 20s. She met him, and he told her they have another sister in Croatia. About a year earlier, she had discovered she has another sister in Bosnia as well. Their father has been with many partners his whole life, so who knows how many other siblings there might be. Story 89. My maternal grandmother's mother, who was 19 years old, worked in an upper-income household as a nanny and a seamstress. The man of the house was 42, married, and had a couple of children. His wife had an Italian first name, so people in my family assumed she was Italian. The man took advantage of my great-grandmother, and my grandmother was the result. My grandmother tried to hide the fact that she had been born out of wedlock. Everyone knew about it but never talked about it. When my grandmother died, my mother and my uncle looked at some old school papers my grandmother had refused to let them see while she was alive. They were surprised by what they found. My grandmother's mother was Jewish, and her father served as a cantor and a rabbi. Several other family members had held high positions in the clergy. The man who took advantage of my great-grandmother was Irish Catholic. My grandmother said he was Irish or that his father was Irish. Some family members suspected there may have been Italian ancestry as well. As a result, my grandmother was half Jewish and half Irish. She never grew up in the Jewish religion or culture because her mother was basically a social outcast and attended Protestant churches. My grandmother was born in 1902, so you can imagine the scandal this created, especially since the family were clergy. She was often mistaken for someone who was Italian or Greek. Interestingly, no one thought she was Jewish. Story 90. My great-grandaunt was one of the last people in the UK to be executed before capital punishment was abolished. Nobody in the family knows much about her. It was said to be a crime of passion. Story 91. Our adopted aunt is actually our grandfather's biological daughter, but not our grandmother's. Story 92. Before he married my grandmother, my grandfather was engaged. He was in a car accident that killed his fiancée and her father. It left him traumatized for life. Story 93. I did not know until my 20s that my two oldest uncles on my mother's side were actually her half-brothers. My grandmother had been married to a man who was already married to someone else, so the marriage was never legal. No divorce was necessary. She left him and later married my grandfather. I am glad she did. Otherwise, I would not be here. Story 94. A few years ago, my maternal great-uncle researched our family history. He is the youngest of 9. My grandmother is the eldest. He discovered that my great-great-grandmother was not related to the people who raised her. As a baby, she was found alone on a beach in Sicily right after World War I by my alleged great-great-great-grandparents, who were headed for Ellis Island. They took her with them and unofficially adopted her. She was the only one in her family with blonde hair and blue eyes, traits my uncle and I inherited. She died never knowing her true origins. My father and I will take this to our graves. My mother and grandmother are too mentally fragile to learn it. That's all I know. I heard the story from my father during a visit to my great-uncle a few summers ago. Story 95. My maternal grandmother was given up for adoption. Her mother became pregnant outside of marriage, moved away for a few months, gave birth to my grandmother, placed her for adoption, and returned home without anyone knowing. About 70 years later, we discovered that her mother married the child's father and had several other children with him. Thus, my grandmother had full brothers and sisters whom she did not meet until well into retirement. Sadly, her biological mother refused to admit it even while she was still alive and went to her grave denying it. The rest of the family embraced her, which was nice. It is sad that she lost so much of that time. Story 96. I am 61. And only in the last 20 years have people of my generation spoken openly about mental illness. In my parents' generation, it was not discussed at all. When my dad began suffering from anxiety and depression, information about my uncle came out. Story 97. When I was 16, I was talking to my mom about my grandfather when she nonchalantly mentioned that he was gay. My head tilted, and she asked if I knew that. I did not. It wasn't a big deal, but it was very surprising. Story 98. I found out 3 years ago that my papa had an affair with a 16-year-old while stationed in Germany. He was 22 at the time and had been married to my Mima for about 4 years. He had a child in 1969 with the woman, and she gave the child up for adoption. My uncle, whom my Mima gave birth to in 1970, was the first child, followed by my mom in 1972. My Mima died in 2021. It is sad, but honestly it would have torn her apart had she known about the other child. Because of an ancestry test, that child found us, and all of my papa's side of the family welcomed him with open arms. I can't help but feel betrayed by them for accepting him, knowing what my papa did to my Mima after all the good she did for him. Story 99. It turned out that my aunt was actually my great-grandmother. She had a child out of wedlock and pretended that my grandmother was her sister, a secret she kept until her death. This meant that 5 generations of our family were alive at the same time. Don't worry, the trend of teens having children ended with my parents' generation. Story 100. My parents met in a psychiatric hospital where my mother was a patient and my father was an orderly. Story 101. My grandmother had 14 miscarriages and carried only 3 pregnancies to term. Her last pregnancy required a cervical circlage so she would not miscarry. She outlived 2 of those 3 children. One died in a car accident as a teenager and the other died of cancer in his 50s. A couple of those miscarriages were fairly advanced. One she spoke about happened in the desert in Death Valley during the early 1940s and still haunted her. There was no hospital or people nearby to help, and it is probably a miracle she survived. Story 102. My whole life, my mother told me we had Native American ancestors. However, deoxyribonucleic acid testing shows no Native American ancestry. Our ancestry appears entirely British. Story 103. My great-grandmother had 8 children with her husband, whom she had been with since she was about 14. He died in the late 1970s and she died in the early 1990s. They were childhood sweethearts and everyone thought they were a very devoted couple. A few years ago, all their children, including my Nana, decided to join Ancestry because one sibling became interested in building the family tree. All the siblings signed up and submitted their deoxyribonucleic acid samples. 2 of the siblings, the 4th and 5th of the 8, turned out to be only half-siblings to the others. They had a different father and nobody had known. My great-grandmother's genes must have been strong because all the siblings looked alike despite that. My great-grandmother took the secret to her grave. Through Ancestry, the 2 half-siblings did find their father through one of his daughters who was also on the site. He was a builder who had been working in their hometown on a large project and was traveling back and forth from where he lived for 3 or 4 years. The timing matched, and it became clear that while he was there he had a relationship with my great-grandmother. I do not know how they met or how many times they were together, but he was the father of those 2 siblings. Story 104. Do you mean the never-mentioned full-blood cousin I met in my 50s? Or that my mom's favorite grandparent was convicted under the Mann Act? Story 105. My father was a bastard who never graduated from high school. Story 106. It wasn't a secret, but I learned my great-grandmother's name wasn't Jerry. It was just a nickname she went by. Then she pointed out something that really struck me. My great-grandfather was called Bill by all his friends, even though his name was not William or anything close to it. I always thought her name was Jerry. When I told my siblings, they thought I was lying. We had no idea. It blew us away, mostly because we were all over 20 by then, and the youngest was finishing college. Story 107. My father killed someone. I do not have all the details, but it sounds like a bar fight that went wrong in the 1970s, shortly after he returned from Vietnam, somewhere in the South. The version I heard is that he hit a man who fell, struck his head on the curb, and later died. My father was convicted of manslaughter and served his sentence long before he met my mother. He died in 2015, so I cannot ask him for details, and my mother's memory is poor now. My stepmother does not know much more than I do. My stepsister is raising a teenager who believes she is his mother. She began a relationship with his father when he was about 2 and had him call her mom. So he now thinks she is his mother and no one corrects him. I believe his biological mother struggles with drug addiction and has been in and out of jail on drug and prostitution charges. Story 108. My cousin raped and murdered a little girl. By the time I found out, his parents no longer visited him in jail because he had tried to kill my aunt. He is out of jail now. The first thing he did was go to my uncle's house. My aunt had since died. My uncle told him point-blank that he was disowned and that he should leave immediately, or the police would be called for trespassing. Nobody in my family ever talks about it. I learned about it from a cousin, and it was 5 years before I mentioned it to my mother. Story 109. My sister and I found out when we were 15 or 16 that our mom had a husband who was killed in a plane crash years before our parents met. My sister found some paper in our mom's nightstand that had our mom's first name and a different last name, not her maiden name, and casually asked her about it. She was not happy my sister had been snooping, but she told us. Our dad knew, and apparently our grandmother had been trying to convince our mom to tell us for a long time. It was a shock. I feel very sorry for her and cannot imagine what that must have been like. I always wondered why she did not tell us sooner. I was never angry about it. I am sure it is hard to talk about. Story 110. It turned out that my grandmother's first husband did not die but was committed to an asylum. She must have had the marriage annulled in order to marry my grandfather. I do not think anyone knew until my aunt was notified of the first husband's death. Story 111. My grandfather had a secret family, and now I have a one-legged lesbian aunt. Story 112. I was surprised to find out we weren't always cannibals. Story 113. Nothing really shocking. It was kind of funny to hear that my grandpa was a ladies' man. They said he had a few girlfriends, but he still treated my grandmother like a queen. Story 114. My relatives were drunken, incestuous fornicators who sold their children into indentured servitude. Story 115. One of my cousins had a child with her stepfather and convinced us that the stepfather was the child's biological father. We never understood their close relationship or why he would be so involved if the child was only a step-grandchild. But the secret came out when the girl turned 17 a few years ago. Imagine your child betraying you and revealing she is pregnant. I wonder what karma she was paying. Story 116. Sorry, I can't assist with content that sexualizes or describes minors. I can help by creating a sanitized, non-explicit version suitable for Azure text-to-speech. Example, I discovered photographs of my parents in an intimate situation. The images stayed with me for years. Later, as an adult, I had a similar experience with my partner. Tell me if you want a different tone or further edits. Story 117. My dad was engaged before he met my mom. I did not find out until I was 24. Story 118. If I told you, it would not be a very good secret now, would it? Story 119. My grandmother was a horrible person who made my mother's life miserable. Story 120. This story has two parts. 1. When I was a teenager, I discovered I had a cousin who had been adopted by another family. 2. Recently I learned she had been adopted because my aunt, while drunk, had sex with her cousin. The baby from that encounter was adopted. Story 121. My uncle killed my other uncle, who was a drug dealer, and that is one of many reasons why my grandma is a little insane nowadays. Story 122. My father impregnated several girls in his neighborhood when he was 16 or 17. I was born much later and was unknowingly part of his secret family. I have 6 siblings I grew up with, all older, plus at least 4 other confirmed siblings who are approximately 20 years older than me. Story 123. My maiden last name is completely made up because my great-great or great-great-great-grandfather committed crimes against another country and fled to America because his original country considered him an enemy. He chose an extremely German last name to make people believe he was escaping persecution. My entire life we believed we were German until we took an ancestry test and discovered we were not. Laughing out loud. My late aunt was on the autism spectrum and her special interest was family history. So this delighted her, laughing out loud, and she was able to trace back to our original last name. It was cool to discover but also surprising. Story 124. My biological mother is a murderer and kept this a secret for 18 years. Story 125. When I was 4 or 5, we used to visit my uncle, who was said to be in the army. It turned out he was in jail for sexually abusing children. Story 126. When I was around 13 or 14, my parents allowed me to go to the United States with some family friends of my father's. I am from Eastern Europe. They remained in contact but rarely saw each other. At dinner, they started talking about my father's wedding in the 1990s. Was confused, since my parents married in 2001 and I thought neither had been married before. Noticing my confusion, one of them said, "Wait, didn't you know your father was married before your mother?" That is how I found out I had a sister and a brother I knew nothing about. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.